All right. All right. So, like I said, the focus of the next couple days is that we are heading towards the end, that World War I is getting very difficult on both fronts. The Western Front and especially the Eastern Front are going to start struggling basically towards the beginning of 1917. You guys saw on Friday through your quick research in at least some capacity what the fighting looked like on either side of those fronts. And so by the time that we hit 1917, and kind of late 1917 into 1918, we are seeing a lot of struggling from both sides. And so we're focusing on basically today, what are those struggles happening that's going to end us to the end of the war, okay? What are some specific events, some specific strategies, some specific things that are happening that are going to bring about the end of the war, okay? All right, so when it comes to the end, right, we kind of have to figure out what it looks like at the beginning, okay? This is just a quick map of the Eastern and Western fronts during World War I. It also shows a progression of how things have been going basically on the Eastern and Western front from 1914 to 1918, the progression of movement. Obviously on the Eastern front, there's a lot of movement over a short amount of time. The Western front, very little over a longer amount of time, okay? All of the battles that we've seen that you researched on Friday/Thursday a little bit are all kind of outlined within those two fronts, or it all takes place within this small area, okay? Oh, what the hell? What the hell? All right. So the Eastern and Western fronts, like we saw. Come on, why is it being like this? All right. It's just tired of me. There we go. All right. Okay, so Eastern and Western fronts are also a main form of fighting, or obviously that's where a majority of the fighting is happening, and a majority of the land mass and the land gains and losses are what's important. But there's also, as we know, a war happening at sea with that naval blockade right off the bat that's eventually going to starve out Germany, as well as other sea battles or kind of sea blockades off towards the Mediterranean, and just a bunch of different things that's happening. Let's talk about the sea war for just a second. The British system, or the British Empire, is going to start using towards the end of the war this system called the convoy system, okay? We realize after the events leading up to the entry of the United States into the war, and especially after the US enters the war, and we are supplying more and more things like war supplies, food, clothing, soldiers that require transportation across the Atlantic, that Germany is going to get greedy with the war at sea, that they are getting better at sneaking around the blockade. So Britain now has to get better at sneaking our boats around around Germany, excuse me. So Germany is getting better at sneaking around with submarines, U-boats, whatever you want to call them. So Britain has to get better at sneaking around them. So German U-boats are continuing to attack not only passenger ships, but convoy ships, military or material ships, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. We want them to be like ready to go when they get there, not tired. That's the different storming of beaches. We don't need that. But it's cheaper. It might be cheaper. And it's good training. Good training. So German U-boats, although we had made them sign the treaty that says, hey, you need to stop attacking the ships, especially ones that have passengers on them, Germany basically says, what are you going to do about it? And keeps attacking them, okay? The convoy system was the answer to them continuing to attack these ships. So allies are protecting supply ships by using this convoy system. Basically, a group of merchant ships would sail together, protected by the warships. So in this paragraph, or I shouldn't say paragraph, graphic, okay, we've got merchant ships kind of towards the center, as well as some merchant ships outlining the sides. Large battleships, large dreadnoughts, lining those merchant ships so that they can safely cross across the Atlantic without getting harmed. We've also got U-boats and submarines that are also going to kind of take the outside course to keep them safe, with the goal of these merchant ships and these supply ships making it safely across the Atlantic Channel without being disturbed, okay? Did this work all the time? No. Did it help, bring soldiers, supply, war materials across the Atlantic safely and more effectively? Yes. Yeah.
Did the merchants pay, or was it paid by like the alliance? Or was it just something that happened because of the alliance?
So like the United States ship, I think you're asking, the United States has a ship full of stuff. It goes over to the alliance or it goes over to Britain. Who pays for it, basically? Britain will eventually end up paying for it. At the moment, nobody pays for anything.
But like, when a merchant wants a convoy, they don't have to pay for it?
No.
Okay, because it's like during a war or whatever.
Yes, yeah. Eventually, as we'll see kind of towards the end of today, or I shouldn't say today, tomorrow, eventually somebody's going to have to pay for it, and it's going to cause a lot of tension. But for right now, we're just helping each other out. We're going to get some profit for doing those things. Not a whole lot, but we're going to get some profit. It's going to help spark our economy. But there's going to be a lot of tension around money very shortly after World War I, but we'll wait until next unit for that. Yeah. So like I said, the convoy system was just a way or a strategy to keep those merchant ships safe from the German U-boats. Did it work all the time? No. Did it work most of the time? Yes. Was it safer? Was it more reliable? Was it better for the transportation? Absolutely. Okay. All right, so the convoy system is mostly being used on the Western Front, or it is there to support the Western Front, okay? These ships are going from the United States to Britain and directly to the Western Front through the blockade that's blocking off the German Reich, okay? On the Eastern Front, we got some other stuff going on, and pretty important stuff, not good stuff for the Allies, okay? So on the Western Front, we have the convoy system, and we've got continued fighting through France. Things are getting kind of worse and worse by the day. On the Eastern Front, we've got some major problems with the fact that there is a whole ass revolution happening within this war, and it's not helpful. Megamind, is that what you just said?
I read his name.
Oh, goodness.
I just knew he had a big forehead.
So, on the Eastern Front, we've got some problems, okay? Specifically, I shouldn't say we, I should say Russia's got some problems, okay? Russia is going through a time that is very, very tense between the people of Russia and the Russian government. The people are upset at the Russian government for how many people they are losing due to battle, that their peasants and their low-class workers are literally starving across the country because of this war. They are unhappy. So in the middle of the war, in 1917, Vladimir Lenin ends up leading a communist revolution in Russia. Okay? Russia kind of looks at the Communist Party and specifically the Soviet Party and says, hey, we got to focus on ourselves. We got to get this taken care of. They're too busy like overthrowing governments and creating coups to deal with the war. They got to get out of it, okay? So on December of 1917, or in December of 1917, Russia officially removes itself from fighting by signing a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, or Litovsk, excuse me, that ends the fighting between Russia and Germany. So Russia has officially removed itself from World War I to focus on the communist revolution and the basically uprising of their peasant people, which is important in two reasons. One, it allows Germany to only focus on the Western Front, on France, because two, it ends Germany's two-front war. So Germany no longer has to focus on the Western Front and the Eastern Front. They can pull everyone out of the Eastern Front because the only person they're fighting on the Eastern Front is Russia. They can pull everyone out of there and start marching back towards the Western Front.
Yeah. So since Britain is currently in control of Asia, yes.
A little bit.
Okay, couldn't they just pull troops from Asia and attack Germany from there?
Yes and no. Yes, it like seems good in theory. No, because Britain that would put their trade market at risk. Basically, if you involve your imperial colonies with war affairs, it puts your trade market at risk, and you won't get the supplies and resources you need to fund the war. Yeah. So, for example, like for a really good example, basically, if we, what's a really good one? Britain needs. What's a good one? Trying to think. Yeah, basically. I was trying to think of more like solid materials, like either food or like metal or something like that, or oil. Yeah, I would say. I was thinking like northern Canada area that they still own a little bit of stuff. Anyway, basically, like if Britain has a bunch of colonies that have a bunch of oil that we need to, if Britain has a bunch of colonies that has oil and we need that oil to run dreadnoughts and other military war stuff, I don't want to take away the people of that colony to go fight when I need them to extract oil. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Wouldn't they have British soldiers there?
Every once in a while. Britain has owned a lot of those Asian countries for a long, long time. Sometimes they're not necessary.
So they're cheaper than just
Yeah.
Do they have a secure reign on them?
Huh?
They have a secure reign.
Yes. At least for another 20, 30 years. They'll start releasing a lot of them very soon, but that's British history. Okay, so the trouble on the Eastern Front when it comes to the Communist Revolution, again, it ends the two-front war. Germany doesn't have to put so much effort into the Eastern Front, actually no effort at all, basically, other than retaking that land, and allows them to focus only on France. They feel like they have taken Russia out of the conversation. The next logical step was to take out France, and then eventually Britain. That's their thought process going on right now, okay? I'm gonna break it up real quick and we're gonna watch a video about the Communist Revolution. It's just a really quick, simplified version of what happens during the Russian Revolution and how we get to the point where Russia leaves the conversation, okay?
The year is 1914. World War I had begun, and Russia was at war with Germany. The working class and the peasants make up the Russian army. However, they are not well equipped or trained for the battles to come.
No.
The year is now 1917. Millions of Russians had been either killed or wounded. The Russian people were angry at Tsar Nicholas II for getting Russia into the war, and several other reasons, including the Tsar taking personal command of the army, Rasputin's power over the royal family, food shortages, and growing political opposition. The first revolution came about in February 1917 on the Julian calendar in Petrograd, which was the capital of Imperial Russia. Demonstrators protested about the lack of bread due to rationing and were soon joined by striking workers. The army was called upon to suppress the uprising. Several protesters were shot and killed by the soldiers. However, many refused to open fire. The army, too, it seemed, had mutinied against the Tsar. The Petrograd Soviet was the city council for workers and soldiers. Now, more and more workers and soldiers elected people to it in order to represent their demands. The Tsar abdicated, bringing an end to the Tsarist autocracy, and a new government took over. This government was run by two political parties, the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. The Bolshevik Revolution. The Provisional Government was also unpopular. It made the decision to remain in the war and failed to give land to the peasants. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks were a faction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and eventually became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He had a simple slogan which would appeal to the people and The Petrograd Soviet, peace, bread, and land. Peace, the end of Russia's involvement in World War I. Bread, solving food shortages, and land, which would go to the peasants. He also stated all power to the Soviets, meaning that he would seize power in the name of the Soviet. On November 6 and 7, 1917, or October 24 and 25 on the Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, launched a coup d'etat against the provisional government. They stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the provisional government, putting themselves in charge of Russia's government. After the revolution, the Bolshevik government exited the war by signing a peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. A civil war would erupt in 1918 by those who were against the new Bolshevik government, the White Army, and the Bolsheviks themselves, the Red Army. Subscribe.
All right, easy peasy. Just a little bit of background information of what the revolution looked like and why it is super important for them to exit the war at that time. They basically just have to work on themselves. They got other stuff to worry about, okay? All right, so when it comes to the exit of Russia from the Eastern Front and from basically the Allied powers at this time, that means it's super important that America comes in and America comes in hard, that they need to really pack a punch when they enter officially basically that Western Front to help out the variety of different Allied forces, okay? By the time that America gets there, or they finally arrive in France in June of 1917, it is led, or they are led by this guy named John J. Pershing, or at least most of the armed forces in France are led by this guy named John J. Pershing. John Pershing is described as basically not as charismatic as like General MacArthur, definitely not as strong as like Teddy Roosevelt in terms of generals, but he is one of only two people to be described as the general of the armies. So George Washington is one and he is the other. And he is a very good strategist. He knows what to do when he hits the ground in France with the limited supplies and somewhat limited amount of people that he has to put forth into this effort. So Germany feels, because of the Russian Revolution, that they have a good strategy on their hands with the basically shutdown of the Eastern Front by the time we get to 1918. But when America enters the story, or America enters the arena on the Western Front, Germany is getting very, very tired, very, very weak, regardless of the new troops coming from the Eastern Front. So Germany thinks it's kind of like gaining its second leg again. It's no longer on the last leg of its journey, that they can turn around and kind of make a statement. But they forget about the fact that the Western Front is still very tired. That the Western Front, they have been losing ever, like, you know, bit by bit, piece by piece as time goes on. And the Eastern Front soldiers have a long way to go before they get there. Between June of 1917 and the end of the war, Germany tries multiple times through a series of battles to break through the Allied defense, but just couldn't do it. They could not get into France as hard as they tried, or further into France, I should say. Okay? They tried and tried and tried, but could not break through those Allied defenses. And that is going to be their ultimate downfall. Excuse me. Excuse me, goodness. All right, I have another small video for you, again, breaking it up. It's just gonna be a couple minutes long about how America makes an entrance as we are getting onto that Western Front. I didn't wanna watch the whole video because it basically talks about a little bit of the Zimmerman telegram, a little bit of stuff that we've already seen. So I'm starting to like halfway through.
was a moment when the United States considered entering the war and chose not to. What the United States does is demand from Germany a pledge not to sink American ships. In early 1917, Germany makes a fateful decision. They realize that their only way to win is to keep American ships from reaching Britain and France. They know that by sinking American ships, they will drag the United States into the war. Their gamble is that they can win before the Americans can get there. It turned out to be a losing bet. Germany begins sinking American ships in early 1917. This leads President Woodrow Wilson to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war.
When we enter the war, we have a combined military force of about 300,000. When the war ends, we'll have over 4 million men in arms. So over 19 months, the American military is going to have to grow incredibly.
The United States adopts conscription, mandatory military service that applied to men between the ages of 18 and 45. Within a very short period of time, the United States turns from having one of the smallest armies in the world to, in fact, having one of the largest.
The modern military doesn't just need numbers, it needs all sorts of people that can do a variety of different jobs. Training these men, having enough officers to lead them, having enough ships to transport them overseas, creating supply lines that can actually keep them fed and armed. This all has to be created almost out of nothing.
It will take us until June 1918 to get the bulk of an army that can make a difference. And by the fall campaigns, we have some 850,000 American soldiers on the continent in Europe, which is comparable to the British Army. We actually anticipated that the war would go on into 1920, by which time we would have a superbly trained and equipped army, and we would win the war. The German army spoiled all of that by deciding they needed to surrender in October 1918. They knew they couldn't hold out any longer because of the pounding of all three Allied armies.
American entry into the First World War did help turn the tide of the war in the Allies' favor. The victory was a coalition victory, and it was the aid that Americans gave to this coalition and the psychological boost that the American entry gave to the Allied soldiers that ultimately resulted in the Allied victory.
Woohoo! So that video just gave a little bit of an insight, like I said, to when America finally touches down in that Western Front or on that Western Front of the war, that it's going to leave a lasting impact of not only a renewed sense of soldier, like literal foot soldiers able to be fighting, like they said, all three Allied powers coming at them at one time, pushing through that and tiring them out, but also a psychological effect that there's a renewed sense of like gusto, right? That we've got all of these new guys coming in, and it's going to help us relieve some of that stuff that they've been carrying for so long and help them win the war. And as we know, we're going to hit the end of the war because not only does America basically come in and pack that last punch, that they aid in so many different ways to get them to the point of Germany just being too exhausted, but the war is ending. This is not just like America comes in and starts whooping ass and just going from there, right? The Central Powers were already very weak. There's a lot of other factors that will relay to the end of World War I. The army of the Central Powers is super, super weak. The Ottoman Empire is basically down and out at this point. Austria-Hungary is also not putting forth a whole lot of effort. It is basically Germany against three major world powers. And Germany is having a lot of men desert, rebel, refuse to fight. They are losing soldiers more than they are gaining soldiers. And not because of fighting, because of personal decision, basically. Yeah, Ryan.
I feel like basically if you turn America or stereotypical America into an ideal, they would rather the war last longer just so they could look better than have it end in 18.
We did. I'm about to say we did. We wanted it to be longer so that we could put forth more effort, basically.
Yeah.
we had very little effort towards the end, or like we didn't have a full army on the ground. So we couldn't take a whole lot of credit for everything. But we, like the video said, we thought it was going to last till 1920 and we could have a whole army, a full force army with, you know, full reinforcements ready to win the war, but it just didn't make it that way because Germany was too tired. Germany couldn't do it anymore, okay? So like I said, other than the fact that the army of the Central Powers, not just Germany, but the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary are just being eaten away at, there's nothing more that they can do. Plus the fact that Germany's people, as well as the people of Austria-Hungary and the people of the Ottoman Empire, are suffering on a personal level. So that blockade on the northwestern portion of Germany's coastline is continuing to starve the people of Germany. It's just bad stuff, okay? So the army of the Central Powers is continuing to get weaker and weaker, and they just can't hold out. So they officially surrender on November 11th, 1918. And the surrender actually comes on a railway car in Compiègne, France. The leaders had basically gotten together and said, all right, we're done, okay? The death toll of World War I, the death toll of World War I ends up with the Allies, so Britain, France, Russia, United States, losing about 5 million people. Only approximately 115 to 120,000 are of US soldier descent, basically. But we can't take that as like we like to think of this like, oh, we're super awesome. We lost less people. We were in it for a lot less. And that was a foreign war. We don't have people who live there. So we're not losing civilians as well, okay? The Central Powers, on the other hand, so Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, their death toll adds up to around 8 million. A significant amount, again, soldiers and civilians. World War II is going to be bigger than that. Yeah. Yeah, around. Yeah, a little bit less, but around. Yeah. But either way, so we know in hindsight that World War II is going to be much more detrimental than this. But in hindsight, or like, you know, in the time period, how much is that? 13 million? 13 million people over 4 years dying is a significant number. It is more than any other war that had previously come before it, basically in any time period in the history of Earth, okay? It was the bloodiest war with the bloodiest battles, the most technology, everything that we had seen ever since, right? When you have weapons like we saw, when you had fighting like we saw, when you had technological advancements like we noticed, there's no way that this wasn't going to happen, okay? So this death toll is insurmountable at this point. We have reached a point where we're like, how did this happen? How did 13 million people die in a span of 4 years? How did we get here? Whoever has the phone out with the music needs to put it away now. I know it's in that corner. Like, how did we get here, right? That's the question that we're going to answer basically over tomorrow, okay? All right, so any questions off the rip about the ending of the war, how we get here, death tolls, anything like that? Okay, so you can go ahead and put your notes away. You will still need just a fresh sheet of paper and a writing utensil to do our activity for the day. But we are done with notes for now. No, you're good. You're good. I'm not. All right. So, the baffling number of 13 million people dying in 4 years is not just baffling for the United States, it's not just baffling for the Allied powers, it's baffling for the Central Powers as well. And now that the war is over, now that Germany has surrendered, now that fighting has ceasefire, there's a lot of other steps after that, right? Even in a war that is not a worldwide war that involves multiple countries, multiple armies, multiple everything, right? Even if it was just 2 countries, there's aftercare, basically, okay? That we have to decide, number one, who is going to be put as a responsibility to all of this? Who is going to be claimed the loser? Who is going to be claimed the winner? How do we move on, okay? So tomorrow we're going to focus on 2 different versions of how the world thought we should move on, okay? But today you guys are going to basically take some time to think about how would you move on, okay? So today's activity, it's pretty simple. What I would like you to do is to get ready for our conversations tomorrow. I want you to talk about or think about a treaty proposal that you would like to see happen if you were a leader during World War I, okay? So in this activity, you are reflecting upon World War I and creating a treaty proposal that will answer the following problems. So you need to have an answer to all 3 of these questions, or at least an elaboration for each of these 3 things, okay? Number 1, I want you to think about what caused the war. How do we stop it from happening again? So think about our main causes, think about other things that happened at the beginning of the war, assassination maybe, other things that we talked about before the war had started, or even before America's entrance into the war. How do we stop those things from happening again? Clearly it was a problem. How do we stop it, okay? Number 2, you gotta think about war reparations. War reparations are payment for damages, okay? There's a lot of broken cities scattered around Europe right now. Who pays for it? How do you pay for it? Yeah.
Who are we keeping in mind that we are?
Let's stay in America's shoes, but basically we can do Allied. Allies are technically the winner in this sense. Let's stay on the Allied version.
Yeah.
Because in theory, the Allied, or in history, the winner is going to choose how this shakes down.
Okay.
So let's think about it from a winning perspective.
Yeah, I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
like, depending on what perspective you're thinking
Yeah.
around, it can be very different.
I would say think about it in a winning or a neutral perspective. Don't think about it as your Germany. Okay. Okay. Good question. Do you have a question, Liam, or are you just stretching? Okay, just to make sure. Okay, so consider war reparations. There's a lot of damage that's done throughout throughout all of Europe at this time. There are literal people's funerals that you have to pay for. Who pays for it? How do we pay for it? What's happening there, okay? And then number 3, how do we maintain peace for the future, okay? We can talk about how to stop this from happening again or how to stop those main causes, but how do we maintain peace from the future? How do we make sure that the people who were attacked very brutally for 4 years don't hold a grudge? Don't try and come back and say, well, you murdered a lot of people. I'm not ever going to be friends with you again, okay? How do we maintain peace for the future while keeping basically everyone involved satisfied? If only it were that easy, right? Just how do we create that treaty, right? So you have a solid 20 minutes till the end of class. I don't think you guys are going to need that much time, but I do want you to explore in depth all 3 of those questions. So if you only need a half sheet, you need a half sheet, but you need to answer all 3 of those portions, okay? Does that make sense? All right, so I'm going to leave you to answer those 3 questions. What caused the war? How do we stop it? Who pays for everything, et cetera, okay? I'm going to leave this up here so you have that for reference. I'll play some music. I want you to just kind of get that done, okay? Yeah.
I'm sick of it. I'm sick of you. Look what you did.
You can think about both of it. So like what happened to America that made them enter, how can we stop them? Or mostly think about our main causes.
I got an answer to all the questions.
What?